wide cinematic aerial view of the Demyansk pocket. It was a cold that did not simply chill the body, it sought to extinguish life itself. In the vast, white expanse of the Eastern Front, where the wind screamed like a living thing, 10,000 men were ordered to fight. Their enemy was not just the soldier across the frozen wasteland, but the very air they breathed, the ground they stood on, a merciless force that turned steel brittle and hope to ice. This is the story of a battle fought at 50 degrees below zero, a clash where the greatest victory was not measured in yards of ground taken, but in mere survival. When 10,000 men fought at -50 degrees, this frozen battle changed everything. Pause. Our story begins in January of 1942, near the village of Demyansk, south of Lake Ilmen in the Soviet Union. Here, the German 16th Army, specifically the 2. and Army Corps, found themselves encircled by a determined Soviet offensive. Within this pocket, nearly 100,000 German soldiers were trapped. But our focus is on a critical, smaller-scale battle on the perimeter of this pocket, a desperate struggle to hold the Rameshevo corridor, the fragile lifeline to the trapped divisions. It was here, in the depths of the most brutal winter of the 20th century, that a force of roughly 10,000 German and Soviet soldiers would collide in a battle defined not by tactics, but by temperature. To understand the sheer impossibility of the task these men faced, one must first understand the landscape. The Demyansk pocket was a nightmarish tableau of frozen swamps, snow-drifted forests, and isolated villages. The air was so cold that breath crystallized instantly, falling to the ground as a fine, white powder. For the German soldier, the Lancer, this was a world away from the blitzkrieg victories of 1941. They were equipped for a summer campaign, not an Arctic siege. Their wool greatcoats were inadequate, their leather boots became frozen coffins for their feet, and their standard-issue machine guns, the reliable MG-34, were prone to freezing solid. Facing them were soldiers of the Red Army's Northwestern Front, men born of this very climate, yet suffering just as terribly. They were driven by a fierce determination to exact revenge for the devastation the invaders had wrought upon their homeland. Their commander, General Pavel Kurykin, knew that the German pocket was vulnerable. Sever its supply line, the Rameshevo corridor, and the 100,000 men inside would wither and die. The corridor was a narrow, tenuous road through the wilderness, barely wide enough for trucks to pass. Holding it was the responsibility of German units like the 58th Infantry Division and elements of the SS Division, Totenkopf, men pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. The strategic stakes could not have been higher. For the Germans, losing the Demyansk pocket would mean the first large-scale surrender of the war on the Eastern Front, a catastrophic blow to morale and a stark signal that the Soviet Union could not be defeated. For the Soviets, destroying the pocket was a chance to deliver a decisive, war-altering victory, to prove that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. And at the heart of this strategic calculus was a simple, brutal, physical reality: 50 degrees below zero. Fahrenheit or Celsius, it scarcely mattered at such an extreme. It was a temperature that rendered the most advanced military technology of the age nearly useless and turned combat into a primal struggle for the next breath. The battle was not a single, dramatic charge, but a relentless, grinding attrition fought over days and weeks. The tension built not in minutes, but in the slow, creeping agony of frostbite and the constant, gnawing fear of the storm. Dawn on January 28 brought no relief from the cold. The sun, a pale and distant smudge in a lead-gray sky, offered no warmth. For the German sentries manning the forward outposts, their watch was a battle in itself. Men would stand for no more than 30 minutes at a time, their eyelids threatening to freeze shut. To touch the bare metal of their Mauser rifle with a bare hand was to lose skin. Pause, they could hear it before they saw it, the distinctive, high-pitched whine of T-34 tank engines, muffled by the snow. Soviet probes began at 0900 hours, small groups of ski troops, clad in white camouflage smocks, ghosting through the pine forests. They were scouts for the main assault, testing the German lines for weakness. By 1100 hours, the shelling started. Soviet artillery, 76mm divisional guns and Katyusha rocket launchers, began a methodical bombardment of the German positions. But the cold played havoc with the ballistics. Shells that landed in deep, soft snow often failed to detonate, their fuses frozen. Others landed with a dull, muffled thump, their lethal shrapnel contained by the immense, insulating snowbanks. The real danger was a direct hit on a dugout or a frozen log bunker, which would mean instant death for the men huddled inside for warmth. The main Soviet infantry assault began in the early afternoon. Waves of men, from the Soviet First Shock Army, emerged from the tree line, their dark greatcoats making them perfect targets against the snow. But the German defenders found their weapons failing them. The recoil springs in their semi-automatic rifles froze, turning them into single-shot weapons. Belts of ammunition for the MG-34s had to be carefully thawed near meager fires, link by link, lest the metal snap. The mechanism for the MG-34 itself, a masterpiece of engineering, became so gummed up with congealed oil that the rate of fire dropped precipitously. Men urinated on their weapons to thaw them, a desperate, temporary measure that offered a few more seconds of functionality. By 1400 hours, the situation was becoming critical. A company of the 58th Division, holding a key rise overlooking the corridor, reported that over half of its men were combat ineffective due to frostbite. Their commander, a young lieutenant named Hans von Brixen, later wrote in his diary, "The men's feet are black. They cannot feel their fingers to pull the trigger. We are not being defeated by the Russians, but by the weather. It is a silent, creeping enemy that we cannot shoot." Then came the tanks. A battalion of Soviet T-34s, perhaps 20 in number, rumbled forward, their wide tracks churning the snow into a fine, icy mist. To the German infantry, equipped with mostly obsolete 37mm Pak-36 anti-tank guns, derisively nicknamed Heeresanglaufgerät or Army Doorknocker, for their inability to penetrate T-34 armor, the sight was terrifying. The 37mm shells simply bounced off the sloped glassy plates of the Soviet tanks with a sharp, pathetic ping. The German line was on the verge of being rolled flat. This was the moment of crisis. The center of the German line was buckling. The 37mm anti-tank guns were useless. The infantry, their rifles and machine guns failing, were being pushed back by the relentless Soviet advance. The T-34s were now within 200 yards of the main supply road, the Rameshevo corridor itself. If they broke through, the lifeline would be severed. The 100,000 men in the Demyansk pocket would be doomed. All seemed lost. The cold became a weapon of mass destruction. Wounded men who fell into the snow would bleed out slower, but they would freeze to death in a matter of minutes. Medical orderlies found their morphine syringes frozen solid. Plasma bags were blocks of ice. The act of trying to give a wounded comrade a sip of water from a canteen could see his lips freeze to the metal rim. The dead did not fall, they often remained standing, propped up by the deep snow, their bodies frozen into grotesque statues. It was a scene from a frozen hell. Pause, for the commanders in their rear echelon headquarters, the reports coming in via field telephone were fragmented, chaotic, and utterly dire. Panzer Durchbrochen. Tanks have broken through. Munition geht zur Neige. Ammunition is running low. The most chilling report simply stated, Verfeuerungen. Über 50%. Frostbite casualties. Over 50%. An entire battalion was effectively melting away, not from enemy fire, but from the cold. On the front line, the despair was palpable. Men fought with a numb, robotic desperation. Lieutenant von Brixen, his company reduced to a handful of shivering, effective soldiers, knew they could not hold. He gave the order to prepare for a fighting retreat, a near-suicidal maneuver in the open, snow-covered fields against both infantry and tank fire. It was an admission of defeat. The corridor was about to be sealed. The battle, it seemed, was over. The sheer, unrelenting, physical reality of the -50-degree temperature had won. Human courage and military training were rendered irrelevant against the immutable laws of physics. The German defense was not being defeated, it was being systematically frozen into submission. But in this moment of absolute despair, a combination of desperate innovation, sheer firepower, and individual heroism turned the tide. The turning point did not come from a single, glorious charge, but from a grim, determined application of force against the one vulnerability the T-34s possessed in this environment, their relative lack of infantry support in the final, critical yards. The first glimmer of hope came from the German artillery, positioned a few miles to the rear. Observers, using high-powered scopes that constantly had to be cleared of ice, finally managed to call in accurate coordinates on the advancing Soviet armor. The 105 mm LU FH-18 howitzers opened fire. They were not firing armor-piercing shells, which were in short supply and often ineffective. Instead, they fired high-explosive rounds, set for airburst. The shells exploded in the air above the T-34s, raining down a torrent of steel fragments onto the accompanying Soviet infantry. The tanks themselves were largely immune, but their supporting foot soldiers were decimated. The T-34s, now isolated, became vulnerable. At the same time, a platoon of German engineers, who had been struggling to bring forward a shipment of tellermines through the deep snow, finally reached the threatened sector. Seeing the tanks approaching, they did not dig the mines into the frozen ground, an impossible task. Instead, they acted with breathtaking audacity. They simply laid the mines on top of the hard-packed snow directly in the path of the lead T-34s. As the first tank advanced, its track crunched down on the mine. There was a deafening explosion, and the tank lurched to a halt, its track blown off. It was now a stationary pillbox. A second tank, swerving to avoid its immobilized comrade, also hit a surface-laid mine. The advance stalled. This was the signal. From the German lines, the few remaining functional heavy weapons opened up with everything they had. A single 50 mm PaK-38 anti-tank gun, its crew having kept the firing mechanism thawed with heated cloths, scored a lucky hit on the side of a T-34, disabling it. But the most critical weapon, the one that truly broke the Soviet assault, was the 88 mm flak gun. A battery of these legendary weapons, originally designed for anti-aircraft duty, had been rushed forward to provide direct fire support. Their high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds could slice through a T-34 at over a mile. At 500 yards, in the hands of desperate, frozen crews, they were murderously effective. One by one, the towering 88s roared, their muzzle flashes a stark contrast to the white landscape. One by one, the T-34s were struck, their turrets thrown off, their hulls ruptured. The Soviet armored assault, the spearhead of the entire offensive, was shattered in a matter of minutes. The Soviet infantry, now without their armored support and being pummeled by German artillery, began to fall back. The German line, held by men who had stared into the abyss, had held. They had not won through superior tactics, but through a desperate, last-ditch application of overwhelming firepower and a refusal to yield to the impossible conditions. When the firing finally died down, replaced once more by the eternal howl of the wind, the cost of this frozen victory became horrifyingly clear. The battle for this sector of the Rameshevo corridor had left thousands of men as casualties. But the shocking truth was that for every man wounded by enemy action, 2 or 3 were felled by the cold. Official German medical reports from the Demyansk pocket would later estimate that frostbite and cold-related illnesses accounted for over 70% of all casualties during that period. Men lost feet, hands, ears, and noses to gangrene. The battlefield was littered with the frozen, dark forms of the fallen from both sides, a grim testament to a battle against an enemy no bullet could kill. Tactically, the German defense of the Rameshevo corridor was a success. The lifeline remained open, allowing the Demyansk pocket to be supplied by air and eventually relieved months later. The Germans pointed to Demyansk as proof that an encircled force could hold out, a fateful piece of analysis that would later influence Hitler's disastrous decision to forbid a breakout at Stalingrad. For the Soviets, the failure to close the corridor was a bitter disappointment, a victory snatched from their grasp by the very conditions they believed were their ally. The true legacy of this battle, fought at 50 below zero, was not in the ground held, but in the lessons learned, or tragically ignored. The German High Command saw it as a victory of will. They failed to grasp the fundamental lesson, that they were not equipped, mentally or materially, for a prolonged war in Russia. They awarded dozens of Iron Crosses to the defenders, celebrating their fortitude, but did little to address the catastrophic lack of proper winter clothing, equipment, and lubricants. The battle changed everything because it revealed, in the most brutal terms possible, the nature of the war they were now fighting. It was no longer a war of maneuver, but a war of attrition against a vast, hostile land and a determined enemy. It was a war where the environment was a combatant, and on that day in January, it was the deadliest one on the field. The 10,000 men who fought and froze in the Demyansk pocket represent just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War, a stark reminder that history is not only written in grand strategies and sweeping offensives, but in the individual struggles for survival against impossible odds. Subscribe to World War II Records, as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to light.